A two-week ceasefire in the Iran war is on shaky ground as all sides accuse each other of failing to properly implement Tuesday's deal. Some ships appear to be moving again through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical economic arteries, and a key element of the US-Iran agreement. But on Friday, those ships were exclusively vessels with links to Iran. US President Trump responded with frustration. In a social media post, he wrote, "Iran is doing a very poor job, dishonourable, some would say, of allowing oil to go through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not the agreement we have." British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, currently on a tour of Gulf states, said he had also spoken with Trump about military options for the Strait of Hormuz.
Been pulling together a coalition of countries, now over 30 countries, working on a political and diplomatic plan, but also looking at military capabilities and actually the logistics of actually moving vessels through the strait. So that was the focus of the discussion last night, reflection on what I've been discussing here, but also that focus on a practical plan in relation to navigation through the strait.
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer speaking there. Now, Siavush Randjbar Daemi is a Middle East analyst at the University of St Andrews in the UK. I asked him who in this conflict actually abides by the ceasefire terms and who isn't.
This really depends on what these terms actually are. Iran keeps insisting that the ceasefire terms include a cessation of fighting in Lebanon. We have seen that President Trump kind of agrees because he's exerting pressure on Netanyahu to at least tone down the scale of the ferocious Israeli attacks we saw, particularly on Wednesday. And on the other hand, however, Iran is not certainly allowing unrestricted transit through the Strait of Hormuz. We have seen that very few ships make it through, and those who do it through Israel, through coordination with Iran. And Iran keeps insisting that it is moving towards implementing a toll process and requiring ships to effectively pay a toll in cryptocurrency for transiting Hormuz. So clearly on both sides, these are elements which should not have happened. There should be unrestricted transit through Hormuz and a complete cessation of hostilities in Lebanon, at the very least.
Now, we just heard UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer talking about military option for the Strait of Hormuz. What could that mean?
Well, there is a lot of jitter in Europe. I mean, we keep hearing that, for example, there are only 3 weeks left for jet fuel reserves in Europe, and the energy crisis is starting to become a situation which can't be managed just by oil reserves that are already stored in Europe. So at some point, there will have to be some more decisive action by Europe, at least contemplating some more decisive action to break the deadlock or face very severe consequences that we haven't yet seen in the European economic system. So I would say that this situation, particularly I would say the more pressing one, appears to emerge as being jet fuel and the impact it could have on Europe-wide air travel could exercise minds and bring a more active stance by Europe.
Now, how much does Lebanon complicate this already fragile situation? Fighting between Israel and Iran-backed Hezbollah hasn't stopped. Now Israel wants to conduct direct peace talks with Lebanon. How does that all fit together?
Yes, well, this is a very complex situation. Again, the current Lebanese government, led by President Joseph Aoun and Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, isn't on good terms with Iran. It has a very frosty relation. We had this crisis over the Iranian ambassador that is holed up in the Iranian embassy without permission, effectively. Those are the people Israel wants to negotiate with, not with Hezbollah directly. And whether the Aoun-Salam side has the capability of disarming Hezbollah really needs to be seen. It's not very clear at the moment. So the Lebanon situation, unfortunately, remains chaotic and messy, as it has almost always been. And that clearly casts a shadow over negotiations. Again, the interesting thing is that despite the fact that Iran kept decrying the situation in Lebanon as a violation of the ceasefire, this wasn't enough to cause the interruption of the negotiations yet. So clearly, Iran sees it as a pressing concern to bring this conflict to an end, notwithstanding the situation in Lebanon.
Siavush Randjbar Daemi there from the University of St Andrews. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. Now, looking toward a lasting peace in the Gulf, Pakistan is preparing to host negotiations between Iran and the US. The White House has named Vice President J.D. Vance as the head of its delegation. Despite Iran's insistence that it will not participate if Israel keeps bombing Lebanon, the Pakistani government says the crucial talks can go ahead this weekend. Islamabad is in virtual lockdown. The army has been deployed, roads have been blocked, a public holiday has been declared. The negotiations are to take place in a cordoned-off area of Islamabad, which is protected by several so-called security rings. Before his departure for Pakistan, Vice President Vance expressed guarded optimism for the negotiations.
We're looking forward to the negotiation. I think it's going to be positive. We'll, of course, see. As the President of the United States said, if the Iranians are willing to negotiate in good faith, we're certainly willing to extend the open hand. If they're going to try to play us, then they're going to find that the negotiating team is not that receptive. So we're going to try to have a positive negotiation. The President has gave us some pretty clear guidelines, and we're going to see.
Eyre is a distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute. He was part of the negotiating team for the Iran nuclear deal in the Obama administration. I asked him which side is going to Islamabad with a stronger hand.
Paradoxically, I think Iran does. Even though they've been on the receiving end of a massive military defeat, the U.S. and Israel haven't been able to translate that into strategic gains, largely for two reasons. Iran retains the ability to retaliate against Gulf countries with their missiles, rockets, and drones. But more importantly, Iran retains a chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz. And President Trump really can't afford to restart military attacks because of the economic repercussions. So I think despite the fact that Iran got beaten badly in the war, it has strategic initiative.
Now, the US and Israel attacked Iran while negotiations on the nuclear program were still going on. Why should Iran trust anything the Americans say?
They shouldn't. Neither side should trust the other. And Iran certainly doesn't trust Israel to hold to the ceasefire. But negotiations are rarely about trust. A negotiated agreement works when it's in the best interests of all parties to follow it. And that gets rid of the need for trust. But you're quite right. There's a tremendous amount of distrust and suspicion on the American side towards Iran and on the Iranian side toward the United States.
You say that the result needs to be mutually attractive to both sides. But if you look at the demands both sides have right now, it seems that like they're impossible to bridge.
Yeah, the demands from each side of the other are ridiculous. They're maximalist demands, but they're starting positions. It's common in diplomacy to start with your best case list of demands. What's crucial is how much you whittle those down to something that's mutually acceptable. But you're quite right. The Iranian demands right now are politically impossible for the Trump administration to accept, and the U.S. demands are far beyond Iranian red lines.
Now, Pakistan is hosting these talks, but many see Beijing's fingerprints all over the guest list there. Is Islamabad the architect here or merely the landlord?
Yeah, Gerhard, that's a great question. They're not merely the landlord, because you need a landlord, but you're quite right. China is the one who, at least in terms of influence on Iran, is applying a lot of pressure. China does not want high commodity prices. Even though its oil is getting through now, to some extent, through the Strait of Hormuz, it needs stability. So China is putting pressure on Iran. Pakistan plays a valuable role serving as a mediator, but in essence, they're the tube. And what's important is the communication that goes between the U.S. and Iran. At the end of the day, that's going to decide whether both sides can reach a negotiated agreement, which I think highly unlikely, or whether they don't, which I think is more probable.
Does that mean that China has an undue influence on the result of these talks, maybe?
I don't know about undue, but because of the immensity of the economic catastrophe that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has had, all countries are keenly invested in these negotiations. The Gulf countries want to have a say. Israel's not at the table, but you can bet they'll be talking to the United States and certainly China, which is, as I said, very concerned about commodity prices. So none of these countries are negotiating in a vacuum. As I said, the U.S. goes to the table keenly aware that the midterm elections are coming. Inflation figures just came out in the U.S. and they're up substantially. So J.D. Vance, Vice President Vance, and Witkoff and Kushner are keenly interested in getting the Strait of Hormuz back open.
Now, you mentioned J.D. Vance, who's leading the U.S. side of the negotiation there. What do you make of that choice?
Again, it has nothing to do with personalities. I know the U.S. is saying, well, J.D. Vance is a good choice because he was against the war as opposed to Mr. Kushner and Mr. Witkoff, who were for it. But at the end of the day, and I speak from experience, personalities play a role, but the positions of the two sides are paramount. So unfortunately, Vice President Vance, much like Mr. Witkoff and Kushner, has no real experience negotiating. The U.S. administration has a demonstrated lack of expertise when it comes to diplomacy, which takes time and sustained effort. They're really not used to doing that. They're used to telling countries what to do and countries doing it. So it's an open question whether J.D. Vance will be able to negotiate successfully with the Iranians, who are experienced and skilled negotiators.
Now, we're going to come to the Iranians being skilled negotiators in a moment. But first, we've touched upon the poison pills. For the Iranians, it's the ballistic missile program, for example. For the US, it's the regional proxies. If neither side budges on these, are we just going to watch a very expensive photo op?
I think, as I said, each side has maximalist demands. But when you boil it down to what the countries really want most, for Iran, for the US, it's dealing with Iran's nuclear program and getting the Strait of Hormuz back open, fully open. And for Iran, it's two things. It's strategic deterrence to make sure they're not attacked again in 6 months or 12 months. And they can ensure that by maintaining control, or at least maintaining the threat on the Strait of Hormuz. And the second thing Iran wants is some sort of revenue, whether it's tolling maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz or lifting of sanctions, because they need to start rebuilding their economy, and also they need to start rebuilding their defense industrial base so they can build more missiles, more drones, and more rockets to help deter this from happening again.
Now let's look at another party in this conflict. While the talks happen in Pakistan, the war between Israel and Iran and Israel and Hezbollah continues. Can a peace deal actually be torpedoed by Israel's actions?
Well, Israel will certainly want to torpedo the peace deal because what Israel is seeking is the collapse of the Iranian state. It doesn't want any sort of negotiation or successful negotiation between the U.S. and Iran. So it will be trying to collapse the negotiations. And you're right, the Israeli attacks on Lebanon, which have not stopped, are a serious threat, especially because Iran has said that unless these attacks stop, the attacks of Israel on Lebanon, then no deal can be reached. But Israel sees the Lebanon front as distinct and apart from what's happening with Iran, and they want control south of the Litani River to neutralize what they see as a security threat. So you're quite right, Gerhardt. That's a serious threat to any sort of successful deal.
Alan, before I let you go, a final question. Do you think there's a good chance that peace will ensue from these talks?
Not a full comprehensive peace. I think, again, primarily for domestic political reasons and for global economic reasons, President Trump is very keen to declare victory and move on. This was a quagmire. It was a strategic mistake. that he wants to extricate himself from as quickly as possible. So I think he'll declare victory and go on to something else. But I don't think there'll be a negotiated peace among the parties. But I also don't think that the U.S. will be keen to resume sustained military operations against Iran. And at the end of the day, that's going to be the least bad option.
The former U.S. negotiator on the Iran nuclear deal, Alan Eyre from the Middle East Institute. Many thanks for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you for having me.